Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with Lavinia by Ursula K Le Guin. This book was originally published back in 2008, and my understanding is that this is Ursula K Le Guin's last novel. I believe she passed away in 2018. So it's the second novel by Le Guin that I've read and chatted here on my channel. I previously chatted The Dispossessed, and I will link to that chat down in the details below. So what's this one about, though? So this is basically a retelling of the Aeneid by Virgil from the perspective of Lavinia, who is the daughter of the Latin king and the eventual wife of Aeneas from Troy, from the poem. I kind of like these retellings, from the ancient Greek and Roman stories, and along those lines, I previously chatted The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, as well as Circe by Madeline Miller. The Song of Achilles tells the story of Achilles and Patroclus from their point of view, retells the Iliad from their point of view, and Circe retells the Odyssey from the viewpoint of Circe. And then I also read the Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood, which was a retelling of the Odyssey from the perspective of Penelope. So I will link to those chats down in the details below if you're interested in checking them out. But I was kind of hesitant to read this one because I am not very familiar with the Aeneid at all. So about all I knew about it going into it really was that it's a Roman poem that is about the part of the founding myth of Rome, and it tells the story of some refugees from Troy led by Aeneas making their way over to Italy. But as it turns out, you don't really have to be that familiar with the poem in order to enjoy that book. Of course, Ursula K Le Guin was a master of her craft, and so, of course, she really knows how to take a reader and take them well into this world. So it was really a delight to read. So as the story opens here, Lavinia is living a happy life as the only child of the king, King Latinus of the Latins, and his wife, Queen Amata of the Rutuli, a neighboring sort of people. And she is of marriageable age, and because she's the daughter of the king, she has really a constant sort of stream of suitors. Lavinia is a pious young woman. She maintains the family, sort of the sacred fire of the household, and performs the daily rituals of the household, the religious rituals. She's pious, like I said, and she also sometimes has gone with her father, the king, to this nearby sacred grove, a sacred altar, and makes a sacrifice there. Now she's older and she can go alone, or rather she goes with a companion/servant who walks along with her on this journey and carries the lamb for the sacrifice. But she leaves her alone then to do the servant leaves her to do the sacrifice and then spend the night in this sacred grove. So she decides to go to this sacred grove to do a sacrifice. She's got a lot of pressure on her to get married, to choose one of the suitors, and her mother is really pressuring her to marry Turnus, who is her nephew, and there's something a little inappropriate about that relationship, it seems. At least Lavinia feels really uncomfortable with it. But since she's an only child, whoever she ends up marrying will essentially become the king of the Latins after her father dies. So she is under a lot of pressure to make a choice. It has been prophesied, though, that she will marry a foreigner. But nevertheless, or someone outside of the Latins. She goes to this grove to make a sacrifice in one particular time, because she's got all this going on, and she's there alone, and she makes a sacrifice, and then as she's sleeping, she falls asleep, and as she's sleeping, something strange happens. She wakes up and she feels like someone's there. It says, "I became aware that a figure was standing within the enclosure on the other side of the altar. A tall shadow. For a moment, I thought it was a tree. Then I saw it was a man. I sat up and said, 'Be welcome here.' So the figure asks where they are, and she tells him that they're at this sacred altar of Albinea, and he goes, yeah, okay. He recognizes that. And then he asks her who she is, and she says she's Lavinia, the daughter of King Latinus. And he comes and sits with her, and he says, I am a wraith, he said. I am not here in my body. My body is lying on the deck of a ship sailing from Greece to Italy. But I don't think I'll ever get to Brundisium, even if the ship does. I am sick. I am dying. I am on my way to Acheron, or else I am in a false dream. So here's one of the coolest and kind of strangest things about this book is the way that it's constructed in this way. The man here at the altar is Virgil, the author of the Aeneid and sort of the inventor of Lavinia from this book. And so, but he's well into the future because we're centuries before Virgil lived at this point. So he's coming to her sort of in this death dream. So Lavinia comes to understand this, how she's somehow been created by Virgil and that her fate has been determined by his poem written centuries in the future. So this is sort of the speculative fiction aspect of this book, which Ursula K Le Guin was such a master of. Lavinia says, I know who I was. I can tell who I may have been, but I am now only in this line of words I write. So to add to this, the mind-bending, Lavinia is saying here, I think, that this version of her that we're about to read, that we're going to read here in this story, only exists in this story. That's where she lives. That's where she exists. And so, that's kind of trippy. And, it goes on to say, as far as I know, it was my poet who gave me any reality at all. Before he wrote, I was the mistiest of figures, scarcely more than a name in a genealogy. So there probably was a historical Lavinia, but the poet Virgil, sort of put her in the poem, although not very much in the poem. The Aeneid doesn't really say all that much about Lavinia, actually. Opening the book here is one of the few lines of the poem about her, and it says, a single daughter, now ripe for a man, now of full marriageable age, kept the great household. Many from broad Latium and all of Ausonia came wooing her. Lavinia says that Virgil really didn't get to know her until this time, until sort of this circle of he created her. She exists in the in the world of the poem, and then he visits the world of the poem on his deathbed where he meets her. But where he meets her is the world of this book, and she's a different sort of character, and he gets to know her better in this book. And she says, he slighted my life in his poem. He scanted me because he only came to know who I was when he was dying. He's not to blame. It was too late for him to make amends, rethink, complete the half lines, perfect the poem he thought imperfect. So, yeah, it's sort of a big circle there. But I thought that was really one of the coolest parts about the book was how this is constructed in this way. So, okay, back to the story. Lavinia comes to know through Virgil everything that's going to happen sort of in her life. Sort of like if you knew your life as a book or as a poem, like there's going to be a war, who you're going to marry, what's going to happen, you're going to have kids, there's going to be a war, she learns, So she learns really her fate through the poem that Virgil tells her as she makes these trips to the sacred altar. So Virgil tells her about the coming of the Trojans and the war that will follow, even though the war is not because of the Trojans coming and making war, but that they upset the peace because it's just a change in dynamics. And the book kind of argues that men just like to make war, that they can't stand peace for too long. And there had been a long period of peace under the reign of her father, and that all comes crashing down with the arrival of the Trojans, who really only are refugees from the war in Troy, and they really just want to find a place to live in peace and prosperity. So the rest of the book then is basically the retelling of the rest of the poem through the eyes of and through the experience of Lavinia, the wife of Aeneas. So some thoughts about the book. I mentioned, you don't have to be familiar with the book to enjoy it. So, I was really sort of hesitant initially, but again, it was fine to not know a lot about the poem. In fact, I have since reading this book, I went and looked up the poem and read about the poem a bit, and it does seem like this story really, sort of enhances that experience of the poem. So I think that's pretty cool. So I think if you were familiar with the poem, it would also be fine. Another thing I really liked about this book was how there was this real sense of being in the time. So this book is set centuries before the poem. The poem, the Aeneid, was written in 19 BC. So this is several hundred years before that when Lavinia and Aeneas is actually living. And so to take us back that far in time and the living in in this community, in this town, the city where her father's the king, in this household, and how that sort of structured, I thought was really, really cool. Of course, Ursula K Le Guin is a master of this. So yeah, I really did enjoy reading this book, and it was Ursula K Le Guin's last novel, so thank you for that, Ursula. I think I will leave the chat though with that, rather than go into all the details of what all happens to Lavinia, her children, her son, the son of Aeneas, and as well as the suitors that her mother, especially that her mother wanted her to marry, and how they all interacted and what ended up happening at the end of it all was very cool, and very enjoyable. But I will leave the chat there. My next chat, I will switch some gears. I will be reading, I have read book 9 of the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, Winter's Heart. I have finished it already, so I will have a chat coming up on this very soon. So until next time, take care. Bye.